Hello, welcome in, welcome in. I hear you're interested in knowing a little bit about Final Fantasy. Yes, absolutely. Well, I can give you a sort of basic overview of Final Fantasy, in case you're interested in any of the games or interested in just knowing a bit more because you've heard it sort of come up or anything like that, and especially, if you have like a significant other, or perhaps you have a child or someone who is sort of getting into it or a little bit interested, and you are wondering, what does it even mean? You've heard the term Final Fantasy, but it always looks a little funny, and you see um, sort of crazy antics, and you hear things, and you're just not sure. So I can totally help you with that. Yeah. Okay. Well, I'll just give you a brief overview of all the mainline Final Fantasy games. I will not touch upon any of the not previous, but other franchises, let's say, like the spin-offs. I might touch upon it if it's relevant to the mainline game, but otherwise, I'll just go ahead and get into it, especially like if you want to know what kind of person likes the specific Final Fantasies and which one you might want to get into as like the first Final Fantasy, then maybe that would be this could be good information for you to know. Okay, well, let's get started then. So for the first one, we of course have Final Fantasy. It was not called Final Fantasy 1 or anything like that. It was just called Final Fantasy. It was released in 1987 in Japan, and then it was released, of course, Final Fantasy is a Japanese game. It is it was once produced, I believe, by Squaresoft, but then Enix bought them, and now they're Square Enix, something like that. But it doesn't really matter for like sort of the basics. It is a Japanese made game, so it came out in Japan in 1987, and then it came out on PlayStation in like 1990. Sort of 3 years later, it was, I believe people really liked it. It's a very is sort of like the first one. It has a lot of there's a lot of things in it that you would recognize it as Final Fantasy, but it's very typical sort of like fantasy, very pixel art, because obviously at the time, like pixel graphics were all the rage because it was the only thing they could do. So basically, Final Fantasy came out, and then they made Final Fantasy 2 in 1988, and then 3 in 1990, and those came out at those respective dates in Japan. However, those didn't actually come to America or the West really until 2003 and 2006 respectively, which would be about like 15 years after their releases. I'm not 100% sure why. I'm sure there is a reason. So if you're going to start with the Final Fantasy, you don't have to start with the first one. It's kind of clunky. You don't really want to overwhelm yourself by trying to sort of experience it in some sort of order. Most Final Fantasies are not related to each other. So Final Fantasy 1, Final Fantasy 2, and Final Fantasy 3 are not necessarily the same story. They're not a continuation, is what I'm trying to say. Now, with Final Fantasy 2 and 3, those tend to get overlooked a lot because Final Fantasy 2 is sort of the successor to Final Fantasy, and just sort of like try to improve upon things. Same with 3. They came out fairly quickly, like in quick succession in actual development. So I wouldn't necessarily recommend starting with any of those. But what I would say is you have Final Fantasy IV that came out in 1999. That one is also pixel art. The reason why Final Fantasy IV is interesting is because it came out in 1991, and then it also came out in the West in 1991 as well. But it was not called Final Fantasy IV. It was instead called Final Fantasy II. That is a little confusing, right? So what kind of person would really be into Final Fantasy IV? It's someone who's really old, someone who, remembers when it came out or might have been confused, right? And so a lot of the times these like early Final Fantasies, people, when they talk about them, it can be a bit confusing because depending on where you lived, you might have a different you might be talking about a different game, right? They all have very similar stories in the sense that they're starting to pick up a theme here now. Final Fantasy tends to have art made by a very specific person, and it tends to be about crystals in some capacity. It tends to be about light and dark. Very, very, I would say typical fantasy, but Final Fantasy themselves try to sort of add their own twist to it. I will say that even in the early Final Fantasies, even though it's called Final Fantasy, you're going to find a lot of tech in it. There is a lot of the borrowing of sci-fi and sci-fi elements, airships, sort of like guns, just like general tech they do not shy away from it, and in fact they tend to use a lot of sci-fi within their like stories and then within their games that it can feel like you're not necessarily playing a fantasy game. So if you're a little hesitant because you're maybe not the most interested in fantasy, right? Then it could be a good option to go for Final Fantasy as a series, because they do end up having a lot of sci-fi. But anyway, if you have someone who is very into Final Fantasy IV, or if they think of it as Final Fantasy II, they're very old, but it still wasn't super super popular. I would say 4 and then 5, which came out in 1992, and then in the West in 1999. 5 isn't something that like people barely talk about. It's mainly because it came out so many years afterwards, and then Final Fantasy VI, which came out as Final Fantasy III in the West. So 4 and 6 are pretty up there in terms of popularity and in terms of the very old Final Fantasies. But that's mainly because that's what people here in the West tended to have. So I can't give you too many opinions on 5 or 2 and 3, really. But what I can say is that I wouldn't necessarily recommend anything of like Final Fantasy 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or 6. I wouldn't necessarily recommend as your starter Final Fantasy, mainly because there's a lot of clunkiness, like video games as a whole and as a genre, or a medium rather, was still sort of getting into its own, it's like developing its own sense of what's good, what's bad, what's like pretty, what's the word I'm looking for here? It pretty, standard, let's say. And so you have a lot of clunkiness. And I don't think that if you want to start a video game nowadays, that you would go for something that's really clunky unless you vibe to that kind of thing. But you might have heard of Final Fantasy VII. That I would say that came out in 1997, both in Japan and in the West. Not at the same time. There are different dates, but same year. Final Fantasy VII is when I would say it sort of broke containment. Final Fantasy before then was pretty popular, but not necessarily everyone's cup of tea. And then you got to Final Fantasy VII, and it's what most people end up talking about when they talk about Final Fantasy, at least at that time. It has, I can tell you a little bit about it, but it is the main characters of, like, if you've heard the name Cloud, if you've heard like Aerith, or Tifa, like those are names that are from Final Fantasy VII, very, very popular. It's also, I believe, when the games made the switch into like sort of full 3D, it's very clunky if you really actually go back and play it. It looks very funny, but I kind of like how it looks because it's very blocky. It's kind of like Roblox. But what I would say is Final Fantasy VII has gained a reputation of sort of being incredibly good, right? And if you were to go back, you might be disappointed because it's not with like modern sensibilities in terms of video games. Going back to the original Final Fantasy VII might leave you with you're going to need to make a lot of you're going to need to forgive the game for a lot of things, is what I want to say. But the writing is pretty good. It's fairly one of the things about Final Fantasy VII is that because it's still fairly early on within sort of video games as a medium, you have because it was 1997, they don't have a lot of storage, and so they're very specific about what they can tell you and what they can show you in terms of like narrative. So they have to really be tight with their narrative, and I think later I'll touch upon this a little bit later, but that is very important. Now, you can, of course, I will touch upon the remakes. So right now, there are sort of Final Fantasy VII, because it was so popular, it's now even getting like a remake. It has like it has the whole capitalist thing of like, oh, well, it was so popular, and because we want to tell the story right this time, we're just going to split it into like 3 different games. And each game is going to be its own game that is incredibly long. And so remember when I was saying about how Final Fantasy VII had a very tight narrative that, because they were sort of restricted on data usage and memory, they couldn't actually create, they couldn't spare anything that was super unnecessary. It led to a very good story. The newer games are very hit or miss, especially, and this is what I'll say. If you're getting into the games, I would not recommend the remakes of Final Fantasy VII. While they do look better, it's way more polished. The dialogue and the narrative is sort of expecting you to know Final Fantasy VII, the original. It's not like a direct retelling, but it's playing with the knowledge of what you already know of Final Fantasy VII. So basically what I'm saying, don't start with the remakes. I think that will really put you off. At least personally, I think it would put you off, but that's up to you. And I also would say if you had heard a lot of the like drama, a lot of the hype around Final Fantasy VII, if you were alive during that time, if you are a wee babe of some kind, I would say you could go back, but you might encounter some difficulties. Now, Final Fantasy VIII is something that came out in 1999, 2 years after 7, and it came out as well in the West in 1999. 8 was, it wasn't as universally loved, but it had some very good qualities to it. It had they sort of leaned into, because Final Fantasy VII had Cloud as the main character, who was sort of this, he comes across at the very beginning of the story as sort of like this bad boy. They sort of tried to do something similar with 8, but they started to lean into a bit more of the maturity in sort of narrative choices. They started that in 7 as well, don't get me wrong, but 8, I think they started to add in a little bit of romance, a little bit of maturity is what I'll say. Not a lot, don't get me wrong. We're still talking like PG, sort of 13-esque writing, but it's definitely one where I would certainly start to recommend. So I think 8 is where I would start, mainly because you're not really getting hit with the hype of 7. 7 at this point has such a reputation around it that you're not going to be able to escape what people say about it, what people think about it. 8, I think, is one where you can sort of, stay in your little spot, play it, and sort of take it at your own pace. Still 3D. And then we can move on to 9. 9 is one that's heavily overlooked. And I think it's because it, 8 was a little bit more mature. 9, I would say, while it has darker themes, its art style is where they started to play around with it. So I would say the type of person that really likes Final Fantasy IX is someone who's a little bit quirky, someone who maybe is like, oh, I love this indie band before they were cool sort of thing, even though that's not really the case, right? 9 is one where Final Fantasy was very popular. It had a popular name at this point. Name recognition was very much a thing for Final Fantasy IX. But people didn't love it as much. They liked it, but the art style, I think people did not love. But I think nowadays, I would actually say Final Fantasy IX looks the best of those three, of 7, 8, 9. 6, 7, 8, 9. What you end up having is that with 9, it aged the best look-wise. If you're going by like the original look. Not just because it was the newest, but because it had sort of a more interesting look to it. I would definitely recommend 9, but only if... Actually, I don't know if I'd recommend 9. I would say 8 is a good one to start, but 9... I would say if you wanted to do 9, you may as well jump to the next one here, which is Final Fantasy X. Now, Final Fantasy X is sort of the second breaking point, the second game that really broke containment, where, people talked about Final Fantasy VII, and then the next Final Fantasy they talked about was Final Fantasy X. 8 and 9 were great, but they did not hit the sort of like sphere of like, a reputation, right? It came out in 2001 in both areas, and this is a game where from my personal experience, it leaned a lot more into romance. There is sort of a very, very pleasant narrative that is sad, but pleasant narrative that is less actiony. It is very actiony, but it's what would I say about it? It's actiony, but it's also not deep. It's dramatic. It's soft. I want to say it's soft. There's the music is very like, it's all piano. Not all, but it has like very nice piano scores. It's they're really leaning into sort of your or sort of character character performances, really. So I would definitely say that 10 is also a really good one to start with. It does have that reputation like 7, but it actually due to some other things I'm going to talk about, I don't think that 10 necessarily has it doesn't have that same, like intensity as 7. They're not like milking it. 7 is the big dog, and then 10 is sort of like, people love it. It is great, but they've not like milked it for all it's worth, kind of. So you do have a sequel in Final Fantasy X. It's called 10-2. This is where it gets confusing, right? This is why Final Fantasy gets confusing. 10-2, because each Final Fantasy game is not necessarily related to the other one. It's different universes, different characters, different. So you can just start with any of them and you don't necessarily need to know the other ones. 10-2 is a direct sequel to 10. And 10-2 is sort of like for the divas. It features like 3 female main characters, and you change outfits to change classes, and to, the combat is all about changing outfits, I believe. From what I understand, it wasn't unnecessarily like, it wasn't a commercial failure in any way, but it definitely didn't hit the same vibe as 10. But from what I understand as well, all the girlies in my life loved it. So who am I to say? I mean, I didn't personally, I did not play 10 or 10-2, so I don't necessarily know the differences exactly. I played a little bit of 10, and I liked what I saw, but I definitely think in terms of the vibe is a little bit more bubbly in 10-2 versus 10. But obviously, do not start with 10-2, start with 10 because it is a direct sequel. Next, you get Final Fantasy XI. Now, Final Fantasy XI is unique-ish in a way because it is not a direct... It's not... Everything so far that I've talked about, from 1 to 10, has been single-player games that you play by yourself, no co-op, nothing. It's just you and the narrative and the combat just by yourself. 11 is where it's 11 online. This is when Final Fantasy started to try and delve into the MMO market, the World of Warcraft market. So Final Fantasy 11 Online came out in 2002 and then 2003, respectively, Japan and the West. And what I would say about Final Fantasy 11, although there was an initial stigma against it because they were like, oh, we don't want like because at this point Final Fantasy had like such a reputation, they loved it. 11, when it came out, they were like, we don't want a like mainline Final Fantasy game to be like an MMO game. That's so not what Final Fantasy is. I would say that obviously don't start with this one. It's very much of its time, very grindy. You want to spend at least 10,000 hours in the game before you get good in it. So definitely do not recommend it. It also is the company trying to capitalize on a lot of what they've set up with previous Final Fantasies. So you'll see in their online games like Final Fantasy 11, they will reference and use a lot of like the jobs, the classes, the narratives that they have used beforehand to sort of tug on a little bit of that nostalgia. So all the more reason why you should not start with 11 or any of their online games. Next up is 12. Final Fantasy 12 both came out in 2006, and Final Fantasy 12 has a little bit of a reputation of being a little boring. I don't necessarily agree, but there's a few reasons for this. Final Fantasy 12 came out, and it was sort of affected by the landscape of video games at the time, where everything was sort of brown. So they set the game in sort of a desert. Everything is a little bit beige, a little bit brown. The writing is pretty good. They're not necessarily... The writing is pretty good, I would say. It's not the best writing in the world, but none of the games are necessarily amazing writing. The main thing I would say from Final Fantasy 12 that people did not like is that the combat, and this might be a positive, the combat people didn't like because it was a little auto combat-y. So a lot of the earlier Final Fantasy games are turn-based combat. And then when we got to Final Fantasy VII, this is something I didn't say. Final Fantasy VII is where they start to introduce real-time combat, but real-time turn-based combat. It's a little confusing. There's a reason why I didn't bring it up. It's because it doesn't really matter. It's kind of turn-based combat anyway. 12 is where they start to try to really like push in the like real-time aspect to it. So you're not like pressing buttons to you're inputting commands to your characters to do things, and they are on a timer. So there's a little bit of like, this might be a little confusing, but there's a little bit of a coding situation with the combat where you could like code your characters to tell them how to do things, and they'll do things, and then you just don't have to do anything. You just sort of watch them fight the thing and beat it, right? And that was very divisive at the time, but I would honestly say that hits a different market of people that like combat that's a little bit more hands-off. So if you're looking for a Final Fantasy game that you can chill, there's some combat, and, you can watch a story, but when there is combat, the combat is a little bit hands off. You just get to prepare beforehand. I certainly love those kinds of games, so I would definitely recommend it. And then the next one I would say is Final Fantasy 13. Final Fantasy 13 came out in 2009 and 2010, and Final Fantasy 13 I think is where this like sort of previous, so from 7 to 12 I would say is an era, maybe two different eras, but the reputation of Final Fantasy has sort of stayed a little strong. 13 is where it starts to fracture a little, not for some reasons that I might not agree with. So Final Fantasy 13 unfortunately came out, and it had it came out during a time, I would say, where the culture was not necessarily, the video game culture, it was not necessarily positive towards women, to put it mildly. And it has the first female protagonist in a mainline Final Fantasy game called Lightning. And with that, I would say that Final Fantasy 13 gets a lot of flack. It was not received very well, partially because of that, partially because of the writing, which I would say the writing in Final Fantasy 13 is good for what it wants to be. I think that the way that they developed Final Fantasy 13 is very dramatic. It's if you watch like the trailer for Final Fantasy 13, and I think if you watch the trailer, you'll get exactly what I'm trying to say and whether this game will be for you or not. It's like watching a CW show. Okay, there's if Final Fantasy 13 is like if Gossip Girl was in sort of a fantasy universe. Everything is dramatic. Everything is to everyone's screaming and crying, throwing up, whatever it is. Everything's a little confusing, and character relationships are all over the place. And I think they went that direction partially because there is a female protagonist. I obviously can't confirm that, but I wonder. It makes me wonder if because first female protagonist, they wanted to maybe bring in a new crowd of people to Final Fantasy, and they're like, oh well, even though all the previous Final Fantasies are plenty dramatic, they're sort of stoic. They're sort of like Final Fantasy VII tends to, Cloud is a little bit like, oh, I'm like a tough guy, and then like he softens over time, whereas Final Fantasy 13 sort of Lightning, the female protagonist, is similar to that. It's actually very similar. She's incredibly stoic, incredibly strong, doesn't want to show her emotions, but everyone around her is like very dramatic and like crying all the time. I personally loved it, but I also kind of wouldn't recommend Final Fantasy 13 unless you are very interested in that kind of thing, because the combat is a little hit or miss, but I actually would say it's actually a good one to start with because there's not a lot of deviation. It's very much like go straight, go from one objective to the other. There's no like going off to the side. You're not exploring or anything. You're just going from a story beat to story beat, combat, story beat, combat, story beat. So if you're sort of wanting to get the vibe of what a Final Fantasy is, I would say 13 is actually not a bad one to do. So next, you have Final Fantasy XIV. This is another online game like Final Fantasy XI. And one of the things about Final Fantasy XIV is that when it came out, it was very bad. And what I mean by very bad is that it was so bad that it was like, it almost like completely shut down the company. Because they spent so much money on it and then nobody liked it. Sort of more so than any other Final Fantasy beforehand. You have Final Fantasy 13 was for a different demographic, and it was released at a time when, people were being misogynistic. Final Fantasy 12 sort of just, people didn't like the colors and they didn't like the combat or whatever. But 14 was sort of like from start to end, every aspect was not enjoyed. And because it was an online game, you also don't have like a strict narrative that people loved. And so they had like a whole situation where they had to shut down the game and they restarted the game under a different name called A Realm Reborn, where they sort of destroyed everything. They got a new director and everything, and now it's going strong. But I would not recommend Final Fantasy XIV. Actually, scrap that. I would recommend Final Fantasy XIV as your first Final Fantasy game if you like MMOs or online games. Otherwise, I would not recommend it because it is such a time investment that it's totally not worth it unless you're looking for something like that. I think a lot of people like Final Fantasy XIV online because it becomes sort of their social network, right? That's where they go and talk to their friends. They don't go on any social media site. They don't post anywhere. Instead, they just log on and they talk to friends there, right? And it's sort of a dying medium anyway, because that was so unique very early on within the realm of like the 2000s, right? Like, oh, you get to go into a game and you get just talk to people. That's chat rooms used to be crazy. But now it's sort of like, oh, you can just DM someone, right? So that's just one of those things where I think it's a dying medium. Now, because 13 was not particularly loved, and by the way, 13 did get 2 different sequels, because even though people didn't love it, it sold really, really well. And so it got a sequel, and then it became a trilogy, basically. 13, 13-2, and then Lightning Returns. Because I believe 13-2, you play as her sister. So 15, they sort of tried to go into... Final Fantasy 15 came out in 2016, and it was very fraught. It actually started development around the same time as Final Fantasy 13, but came out way later, because after the backlash of Final Fantasy 13, they tried to scrap any relation to Final Fantasy 13. And so 15 is just a boy band. You play as sort of a group of boys, sort of emo boys, going on a little road trip tour adventure. The problem with 15 is that they spent so much money, and it was its development was very fraught, that it ended up being worse than the sum of its parts. Some parts of it were good, a lot of it was bad, and a lot of it was not in the game. And what I mean by that is there is an anime, multiple animes, there is a movie, there is there are multiple smaller games that tell different aspects of the story. And unless you consume all of that content before jumping into this game, it's not going to make much sense to you. And things happen off screen that the narrative is all over the place, is what I'm trying to say. It can be pretty fun. I would say the combat's very nice. They've sort of ditched the turn-based completely at this point. They've stopped trying to... They leaned very heavily into the action now. So I would say that if you want to try an open world game, this is also an open world game. So this is the first of the the first game in the Final Fantasy series that is just completely open world, where you get to explore and stuff. So if you like open world games, I would recommend Final Fantasy 15, but I would not necessarily go in there expecting the narrative to wow you in any capacity. Next, you have Final Fantasy 16. This is the latest Final Fantasy game. It came out in 2023, and I did not play it, but I do know it's made by the same people who made the online game. So it's like moment to moment gameplay is a little lacking, but this is where they jump into more of a Game of Thrones-esque writing, where they're trying to take it into an even more mature level. They're trying to go 18 plus in this death and blood and whatnot. Whereas beforehand there is death, but not a lot of blood, and not a lot of everything's couched, in that sort of teen-ish filter where they try and talk about everything in sort of a teen way. I think Final Fantasy 16 tries to do away with that to mixed success. So those are all the Final Fantasies. If I were to go back now and tell you the ones that I would recommend you start with, I would say skip the early ones. You don't need to do the early ones. If you're interested in sort of the big reputation one, 7 would be good, but you might be a little disappointed because at this point its reputation has has succeeded its own game, right? It has a bigger reputation than what it has to offer, in my opinion. And then you have the remakes, which I wouldn't recommend. 8 is one that I would recommend. 10 is definitely one that I would recommend as well. 12 I would recommend if you like sort of city management games, if you like games where you just get to watch things do their little thing and you don't get to actually do moment-to-moment actions. I would actually say it's if you like the Sims, honestly, I would say 12 might be a good one for you. 13 would be good if you love CW, if you love CW in the 2010s, in the 2010s. So if you like kind Gossip Girl, Pretty Little Liars, if you liked Grey's Anatomy, if you liked any of like the Euphoria, any it's very dramatic. Say you're Gen Z and you really love Hot Topic, and you love sort of the like, I brought you a cookie, sort of that little monster that's on those shirts. You love the like pink and black and the sort of like, if you listen, I had that phase. If you like that, and if you're like I'm born in the wrong generation, I wish that I was a millennial that was in school in 2010, I would say Final Fantasy 15 is the game to go to. And then 16, I would say go to it if you're just wanting to play the sort of most recent Final Fantasy game, just to see where it's at. But I wouldn't recommend it, to be honest. Okay. Does that answer your questions about Final Fantasy and the basics of Final Fantasy? Okay, yeah. Well, I'm glad that was very helpful. If you want to know what my favorite Final Fantasy is, well, that, of course, would have to be Tactics. And I did not cover that because it's not a mainline game. But I actually would say that is the best Final Fantasy to start with and the only Final Fantasy worth playing. Otherwise, if that will be all, then you can have like a wonderful night and a great day. And let me know what Final Fantasy you are going to start with. Okay? All right, then. Bye-bye.